Antarctica. Let me start. Let me welcome all of you to tonight's meeting. Thank you for coming. I'm going to be speaking about diving in Antarctica. Antarctica is a big place. It's about the size of 1.5 United States. And so when I say diving in Antarctica, there's very little inland diving, although we'll should be showing you a little bit. Most of it is coastal. But we're only going to look at sample a small section of the entire continent. One of the things I really love about working down there is that when you talk about seeing places that no one's seen before, this is one of the true places on the planet where we can still do that. And to me, that's a big part of why I enjoy diving. I feel like I'm still exploring. Even if it's a place where people have been diving before, it's not the first time that I've been diving there. You know, I haven't been there before many times. And even in places where I have been, there's still new things to see every time I go out. That's one of the things I really love. And so we're going to talk about Antarctica as a place where people can still explore. Nope. Let's see here. So Antarctica is, and Barb, you're going to need to let people in now. I think I've just left the screen where I can do that, so you know.
Yeah, I'm good.
And if people have questions, probably don't put them in chat because I'm not going to see them. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. Or Barb, if you happen to see something in chat, don't be afraid to interrupt me. Antarctica is known as the coldest continent on the planet. Most of us know that. What most of us may not recognize, however, it is also the highest continent on the planet and the driest continent on the planet, surprisingly enough. Much of Antarctica is covered up to 3 miles of ice, and that overall amount of ice raises the elevation, making it the highest continent there. And there's very little fresh precipitation. It is an Arctic desert in terms of the amount of precipitation it gets. We're going to first start at McMurdo Station, which is about 2,500 miles south of New Zealand. So when I was working there, I started working there in 1989, and we would fly to Christchurch from Los Angeles. And then from there, we would fly on a flight to Antarctica itself. And this is one of the planes that we've landed in. I've taken C-130s and C-141s, C-5. This is a C-17. And they actually don't land on Antarctica. They land on the ocean. This plane is sitting on top of the ocean right now, on top of frozen ice. And it lands on the frozen ice. And you can only use that as a landing runway strip while the ice is solid. But as the ice starts to warm up later in the season, it gets soft enough that the ice will no longer support the weight of the aircraft. And in fact, in 1964, one of their aircraft cracked the ice and fell to the bottom of the ocean. So that's not necessarily a comforting thought when you're landing on this. And I was on the very first flight of the C-5 Galaxy, which was the largest cargo ship in the US aircraft arsenal at the time. We're landing on Ross Island, which is one of the sites of one of the few active volcanoes in Antarctica. You can see the steam plume coming off of the top of the mountain there, and a colony of Adelie penguins in the foreground. And this is the town of McMurdo, the beachside resort, I should say. And let me see, can you guys see my cursor? This is the shoreline here. So if you want to go out and lay on the beach and get a suntan, you know where to go. And it's a very scenic place. It looks kind of like early industrial ghetto. There's not much to recommend it from a scenery perspective, but this is the largest research station in Antarctica, with upwards of about 1,300 people that stay there during the summer. We went in the first week of October, the beginning of the summer season there, late fall actually, and this was the last sunset we saw on October 15th. So it's daylight 24 hours. All of the work down there is sponsored by the National Science Foundation. So Jose and Kathy and Justin and Barb, all of you that are there, Levi, Gene, I want to thank you for sending me on my 6-month paid vacation to Antarctica to be able to go scuba diving. I very much appreciate all of your contributions. The reality is it's anything but a vacation. When they were diving there and looking before, they didn't allow scuba diving. So they actually did their underwater observations by drilling a hole in the sea ice, which was anywhere from 7 to 9 feet thick, and then lowering a pipe with a small observation chamber in through the ice into the water. And people would climb down the inside of the pipe with the rungs welded to the inside as a ladder, and they would sit by these windows and watch animals swim or drift by. And the problem with that, of course, is that if you wanted to see something closer, you can't. You're at the mercy of the currents and the movements of the animals. So in 1957-58, during the International Geophysical Year, they actually sent a free diver down there to be able to do all the sampling and observations. And so he would have a hole and he would hold his breath, swim underneath the ice and do his collection work and bring the samples back to the biologists. And he was diving a wetsuit, not a dry suit as in this picture. And his name was John Resick. And he actually was one of my mentors when I was learning to dive and became a dive instructor. And so he would tell these stories in class about all these things he did in Antarctica in 1957 and 58. And I always thought to myself, you know, I'd really like to see that someday. And I was learning to be a chamber staff, a volunteer recompression chamber staff member at the Catalina Hyperbaric Chamber. And somebody stood up in the audience and said, hey, we're looking for someone to go down and oversee dive operations at McMurdo Station. And I talked to them and I initially turned them down, and they eventually talked me into going down. And I then went and spent from 1989 through 1992 working to support the scientific diving operations out of Ross Island and also Palmer Station on the Arnara Peninsula. And they still use the observation chamber, mostly for morale reasons, not so much for research now, but we can go diving right next to it and bring animals to people to see that are down there looking through the chamber. Now, one of the issues is trying to get to the actual water. I mentioned the sea ice was 7 to 9 feet thick. So we would start with a giant auger and we would drill holes through the ice where we can get close enough with a tractor to be able to actually bring the auger. Can you guys hear me okay? Excellent. We would then drag a wooden fish hut over the hole that has a hole in the floor that we would line up with the ice holes that we bored. And that's how we'd get in and out of the ice, in and out of the water. And so you would dress in the structure, the hut, out of the wind, and I would say out of the cold, except for the temperature on the floor was usually around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And the temperature at the ceiling was usually about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So you could find whatever temperature you wanted as long as you were able to levitate at the proper level. But at any rate, we would get dressed out of the elements and then go for our dive. We would climb in the water. There's a wooden ladder that we would use. And then we would go down lines and underwater, you know, the surface conditions, when I stepped off the airplane, it was a relatively mild day at about 20 degrees below zero. In the water temperature was stable at 28.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the freezing point of salt water there. So it's a couple degrees colder than the freezing point of fresh water because of the salinity in the water. And because we were diving there at the end of the winter and the beginning of the spring, water visibility was such that there'd been no plankton because there's no sunlight for 6 months. There's no currents because everything is covered with ice, and so there's little water flow. And everything settles out of the water column. And the visibility was between 800 and 1,000 feet. So that's better than I've seen any place else on the planet. Then later on in November, the visibility would get really bad as the sunlight came up, and the visibility would drop to about 300 feet. So we had to tolerate 300-foot visibility later in the season, which wasn't always as much fun. And then in the space of about a week after the sun is up more and the plankton really starts going, visibility would drop from 300 feet to about 3 inches in the space of less than a week. And at that point in time, we typically stopped diving, just because it was unsafe. If we couldn't get close enough to drill a hole, then we would actually use explosives and blow a hole up. And then we would take an entire day and clean ice cubes out of the hole to be able to get in the water. And some of these ice cubes could be up to the size of a Volkswagen bus. And you had to be really careful because as much as ice blew out of the surface, it would also blow into the hole as well. And so this is the underside of that same hole. And you can see all the loose ice blocks around the edges. You had to be very, very careful getting in and out not to dislodge those, because you could send up a block of ice the size of a Volkswagen bus, block the hole, and you've got to rely on people on the surface to keep that ice clear. And if you knocked a really big piece of ice, they can't do that. And of course, that ice is freezing while you're underwater because air temperatures can be pretty chilly. And so you had to leave people on the surface that were there with nets and shovels, keeping that ice hole free while you were diving. And I remember on one particularly cold day, it was about 45 degrees below zero, that the water was freezing so quickly that they literally couldn't shovel it out fast enough. And I had to push myself through the ice, through essentially a slushy. Think of a slushy that's 5 feet thick, trying to get myself out of the water. It was somewhat disconcerting, shall we say. Now, some of the dive sites that we dove were not close to town at all. And so we would take tracked vehicles, tractors, and track along the sea ice surface to where we wanted to go diving, which may have been 20 or 30 miles away. And this is the equivalent of Interstate 5 leaving McMurdo Station. This is on the ocean. We're on sea ice right now, and we're following a line of flags. And those flags are placed about 15 feet apart. And the flags serve two purposes. One of them is to mark where the ice is safe, because there's cracks in the ice and you can't necessarily see them. So part of our support team goes out and flags a route to where we want to go that doesn't have any cracks in it, so that we know where to drive the tracked vehicles. The other reason is that weather conditions, surface conditions, can change pretty rapidly. So we would grade weather conditions into 3 levels. The best level was temperatures above -20, winds less than 20 knots, and visibility better than 50 feet. And then we would use the flags to go from flag to flag to be able to know where we're going. Level 2 was visibility from 20 feet to 50, or temperatures between -20 and -40. And then level 3 conditions, and we would limit travel then. And level 3 conditions, we would come up sometimes during a dive and not be able to see 15 feet from one flag to the next. And during those whiteout conditions, we couldn't travel at all. And so wherever you were, you stopped. And however those whiteout conditions lasted, you had to stay where you were. So we never went out there without sleeping bags and food and stoves and tents, able to live wherever we happen to find ourselves in case the weather conditions degraded while we were either in the field or underwater. And these are the kinds of cracks we're looking at. Sometimes these cracks might only appear to be 2 or 3 inches wide. This one looks to be maybe 2 feet wide, and we could easily cross that with a snowmobile. But what you don't know is how much of those surface cracks are thin ice versus thick ice. And this is that same crack. Looking at it from underwater, you can see that 2-foot wide crack is the black portion of it right here. But the actual sea crevasse was about 10 feet across. And so that's not safe to cross. And so they actually built the path to cross about 100 yards from where this picture was taken, where it's not as wide. And so it's very difficult to ascertain what the conditions are on the surface when you're just traveling without knowing by coring through the ice to see how thick the ice actually is. And this is a picture of one of the tractors. You can see the outline of it here. And this is the tracks here. And these are The orange is the paint of the tractor that fell through the ice in the early 80s. And we located again, and you can see how much growth has taken place while it's been underwater. And in this particular case, there were 4 people in it. 3 of them got out, they were divers. One of them turned around to get his Nikonos camera from the back seat and wasn't able to escape from the tractor before it sank. And so he actually lost his life when it went through the ice. So it's not necessarily a very forgiving environment in which to work. Underneath these cracks, because the seals use them to get in and out all the time, there's lots of fecal material. They poop a lot there. And so there's lots of organisms that are there while you're diving. That's a really great place to go see animals. They're literally lying on top of each other because of the food supply there. Some of the animals get really large. This is an isopod, which is quite large. This is a pycnogonid, a sea spider. We have sea spiders here in California. They get to be maybe 1 millimeter across. This one was as big as my outstretched hand. And in fact, I would collect these as part of our scientific studies. You can see all the little sea spiders there. I used to have nightmares sometimes about coming across a pycnogonid that was maybe 8 or 9 feet across, and that instead of me collecting it, it was trying to collect me. And now this picture reminds me of Shelob and the spider in the cave in the Harry Potter story. I think it was the second Harry Potter movie where he goes in the cave with the spiders. And the spider says, well, I promised not to eat you, but I didn't promise that my kids wouldn't have a chance to eat you. So, but it's interesting that the organisms there get so large. And that's one of the areas of research that people are down there studying, is why and how they manage to survive. Some of the sponges down there are the size of a Volkswagen bus. They just get huge. And when I was working there in 2016, my last trip with the National Science Foundation, I really had a good time because my entire reason to be there was just to test rebreathers. And it gave me a chance to do nothing but photography because I didn't have other research activities. And so I didn't have much chance normally to shoot pictures. And this is where I found out that you don't have to force yourself to go to places like Tahiti or Fiji or Sipadan to go see soft corals. You can see just as nice soft corals in Antarctica in cold water without having to suffer through, 85 or 88 degree water. So if you're looking for some place to go see soft corals and you don't want to have to tolerate, being in that warm water stuff, there's other places you can go see. One of the really interesting formations that we saw down there is called anchor ice. And in the far south, where Ross Island is and where these pictures are taken, it gets cold. The coldest day I went diving was 63 degrees below zero. And that cold permeates the rock. The sea level, the sea surface freezes. It freezes at 28, so it insulates the water. But the cold is actually transmitted all the way through the rock by the wind and the cold on the surface, and it forms ice at the bottom as well as on the surface. And sometimes this ice, which can be several feet thick, will break off because it wants to float, and it will pick up organisms, drift in the current, and redeposit those organisms someplace else. And that's one of the ways that animals are transported and migrate down there. I mentioned that the water is cold, and the water is cold enough there to freeze the flesh of most fish. If we took a Garibaldi and dropped it in Antarctica, even if we gave it a sweater, it would actually freeze because the water temperature there is below the freezing temperature of the flesh of the fish. And so the fish that live down there have actually evolved a natural antifreeze that's about 200 times more effective than the man-made antifreezes that we put in our cars. And so that's another area of study. And there's a lot of biomimicry studies that go on down there where material sciences and scientists are trying to replicate those things that Mother Nature has done on its own through millions of years of evolution. So we're learning from what Mother Nature has done. Now, when I mentioned that we had to get in and out of the water, we're doing it through a single hole in the ice. And so typically our dive teams are anywhere from 2 to 5 people when we're working. And that hole will only support one person. It's only wide enough for one guy or girl to go through the hole at one time. So we have to take turns. So if you're down there shivering, people have to decide who's going to go first. We would do that based on who felt the need to be able to get out of the water based on exposure. And our typical dives down there would last anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. I think my longest dive was about an hour and a quarter. And I literally was crying from the cold in my hands because it was so painful by the time we finished. The problem is that we aren't the only people that don't want to be underneath the ice sometimes. And in fact, there are other air breathers that swim underneath the ice. Weddell seals keep their own holes open by chewing through the ice, and they live there all winter. And these guys will go in the winter through a hole in the ice that they've been chewing to keep open, and they'll swim free dive. Somebody here wanted to take a free diving class this weekend, next weekend. I don't know who that was. Do you know who it was, Barbs?
Actually, I do. It's in the chat.
Okay, so think about this. This is your objective for your free diving class this next weekend. I want you to free dive down at night in complete darkness without a light to 700 feet, catch yourself a fish to eat, and then free dive back to the hole that you started from and come up within 3 feet of where you started.
Yeah, that would be very hard to do.
You know, the navigational abilities of these animals is astounding to me. And you talk about wonder and awe, and that's the kind of thing that I sit and think about and look at when I look at these critters. But these guys come swimming by and they say, ah, wow, look at that. Somebody made me a hole. And they go up and they use that hole to breathe. And they weigh about 1,200 pounds. They're bigger than me. They're bigger than you. They're bigger than any 5 of us put together. And they don't always want to be dislodged from where they are, because then they have to hold their breath and go someplace else. And so sometimes we have to encourage them a little bit to get them to move so we can get in and out. And the reality is because we know that this happens sometimes, we oftentimes build an emergency hole 50 or 60 feet away so we have another exit if we need it. And you keep that one covered with a board so that the other animals aren't encouraged to use it. This is one of the more interesting things I saw down there. This here is a wall of solid ice. This is actually on the continent of Antarctica, not an island offshore, Ross Island. And this crack here where the sunlight is coming in is between the sea ice that covers the surface and the continent itself. And this crack looks like it's light because it's a crack opening, but it's not. What we have is ice that's 15 feet thick here, and the crack is only about 10 feet thick. And so it lets in more light, so it looks like an opening. And this bottom here, you see all these bumps, all the bumps here? Those are all scallops. So if you guys are having trouble getting a limit of scallops going out to the rig any given day, or off of San Pedro, here's a place where I can recommend, where I can almost guarantee, even if you collect game like I do, which is somewhat impaired, you can get a limit of 10 scallops here, even without, having to spend 4 hours looking. And the most interesting thing here, and let me go back a page here, page down, whoops, back. So we're looking at this wall. This wall is a solid wall of ice. I don't know how it formed, but as you're swimming along it here, you're seeing the bodies of animals encased in the ice. Any of you ever had fake ice cubes that had like a fly frozen in them and you put them in somebody's drink, to get them a hard time? Well, that's what this ice looked like. And one of the more interesting things I saw was this crinoid, where the bottom part of the animal was frozen into solid ice and the top part of the animal was still waving around and feeding itself with stuff that was coming by in the water column. Because remember, the water is 28 degrees and the ice is 32 because it freezes as saltwater ice. And so the temperature didn't bother it at all. Now, some of you are divers, I presume. I know that all of you are not. Some of you are free divers and some of you are non-divers, I happen to know. So what does it take to be able to tolerate water temperatures down here? Well, we're using dry suits. I would start with a base layer of expedition weight polypropylene. I then personally wear weasel underwear on top of that, which is essentially a very thick form-fitted sleeping bag that is custom made to fit your body. And then I would wear another layer of polypropylene insulation, a vest on top of that. I would wear several layers on my feet, a layer of thick wool socks, followed by those are fur-lined booties. And then we put a dry suit on over that. And for those who don't know what a dry suit is, it's essentially a Ziploc baggie that fits around your body and then seals with a waterproof zipper. And then we have to protect our hands, and our hands are actually the most exposed area. They're the ones that we have the most problems with. And so we use dry gloves or mittens that attach and mate to our gloves. So we've got a waterproof seal. And then underneath that, I wear several layers of gloves along with these chemical heat pads that generate heat. And even with that, the temperature in my hands is usually the limiting factor in how long I can tolerate working underwater. For the rest of our gear, we use cylinders that have 2 valves on them because with the cold water temperature, it's not uncommon to have a first stage free flow. So we wear 2 first stages and then 2 second stages. And if one fails, we can turn that off and go back to our second stage there to be able to dive. My last trip with the NSF in 2016 was testing rebreathers. And I mentioned earlier that rebreathers get used for a number of purposes. One is to stay longer because your gas supply is really efficient. You know, I've done 8-hour dives on a rebreather, 8-hour single dives, but you're not going to do that in Antarctica. Rebreathers let you get closer to animals. This is a shark cleaning station. This was taken over a week's period of time by an open circuit diver, a regular scuba diver. That was the best shark picture they got, a group of 23 people in a week. I was down there on a rebreather. Literally 15 minutes after they left, this is what it looked like right in front of me. And for those of you who are photographers, that's taken with a 10.5mm lens. So my camera was essentially touching the fin of that shark as it swam by me. So rebreathers allow you an opportunity to be able to have really different and more spectacular interactions with marine life, which is one of the things I really like about it. But that we don't really have to worry about that in Antarctica either, because we're not seeing those kinds of animals. What we were interested in, however, another whale picture, we were talking about whales earlier. What we were interested, however, is diving in the freshwater lakes inland in Antarctica. And this is a picture of one of those lakes. About 2% of the continent of Antarctica is not covered with ice perennially. This is one of those areas. This is called Lake Frixell. This is the Canada Glacier in the background here. For scale reference, this shadow is a cliff face that is 10 stories high. This lake, this is the surface of the lake, has 23 feet of ice covering it. And underneath that ice is life. We're studying this. When I say we, I did some of the support diving. We, meaning scientists in general, are diving in this place because this is an analog environment for where they think they might find life on Mars. The surface temperature here is about the same as the surface temperature on Mars. They've found ice deposits on Mars. It's possible there may be liquid water on Mars. And here in this inhospitable place, 23 feet of ice, never melts, never liquid surface. We would dive down through holes in the ice that we made, down through the walls of ice, and this is where you can see the seasonal variation. Summertime with algae at the bottom releasing bubbles of oxygen. Wintertime where all photosynthesis stops. Summertime again where you get photosynthesis. You can see years of accumulation of bubbles in the ice on top of the island, or on top of the lake. And we were studying the water chemistry and what it's like there where this life lives. And that water is layered like a layer cake. And so we would put in instruments. We can't dive there year round. The weather is so harsh and we can't travel there. So these tubes would suck up a sample of water once a week and then fix them so that we could come back and study the water properties throughout the year by looking at the different bottles of water. And we had one array like this in each of the 3 water layers. But if we went down to the lower water layer, our bubbles would mix the water going up. So we're looking at using rebreathers to be able to dive down, collect our samples without destroying the environment that we're trying to study. Couple of pictures of other animals down there, some really big jellyfish, some animals that I would have sworn came from underneath the lakes, the ice on the Titan's moon off Saturn. And then I also mentioned that I dove sometime in Anvers Island, about here where Palmer Station is. That's where the United States has its other coastal research station. So McMurdo is on Ross Island, Palmer is on Anvers Island, just off the coast of Antarctica, south of South America. And so
Jeff,
this is much, yeah,
would you go back a couple slides?
sure.
What was that eyepiece that you have on?
Where
Go
are you
back.
looking?
Keep
This?
going forward. No, the other way.
The other way forward? My other right?
There, wait.
Wait, wait.
Back, that one.
That
There's
one?
like, yeah,
You're looking at these?
yeah.
Okay. I have to confess now, Barb's, I'm getting really old. In fact, I just got back from Cocos Island, and it was completely dismaying to me that I was the oldest person on the boat, on the liveaboard. 2 weeks, and I'm used to thinking of myself as being the youngest person. I was the oldest person. No crew, no dive guides, no other divers were older than me. That was really disheartening. And you have to bring this up. Those are readers. Those are magnifying glasses so I can read my gauges. And that's a mask that excess scuba sells for old farts like me that need to be able to see small letters because I can't read my computer anymore.
Okay, no worries.
So thank you for bringing that to everybody's attention for me. Anyway, going on, Palmer Station I worked at also in the early 90s, and I got a chance to visit there again in 2009, and I brought my then 11-year-old son with me. So this is myself and my 11-year-old son, Evan, who became the youngest person to scuba dive down there at the age of 11 years old. And we were at Palmer Station, and Palmer is a much smaller station. There's a maximum of 43 people that live there, as opposed to 1,300 people. And we were diving there, and one of the places that we were diving was here. This is, in case you don't recognize it, a shipwreck. And it's an Argentine shipwreck where the captain in 1987 was told, don't go between these 2 islands. It's not deep enough. And the captain said, I've been a captain in the Navy for 20 years. I know what I'm doing. Took his ship there, tore the bottom out, turned turtle, and it became a dive site. And more so, became a research site. And when we first started diving it, this is entering the wreck. This picture here was taken when I was there in 1989. And this is oil, bunker oil, that was fuel that filled the top of the cargo hold from the oil that was escaping. And this picture was taken 17 years later in 2009. You can see the growth on the tractor, the same tracked vehicles that we have here, but the oil is gone at the surface. All that is gone in the environment. And one of the things, this is another picture soon after it sank. Everything's better with Coca-Cola, as you pointed out to us earlier. We were sampling the sediments at different distances from the wreck, and also the organisms, and grinding them up and seeing how the hydrocarbons were migrating and how they were being incorporated into the environment. So it was a study in pollution. Other fun stuff. I got to do some fun stuff that was not really research related while I was there. This is the tongue of the Erebus Glacier, which comes off of Mount Erebus here. So glaciers are really dangerous to go on because on the mountains, they go over hills and bumps, and they form these big cracks called crevasses. And they get covered with snow bridges and snow. And if you go walking on them, you can break through those snow bridges and you fall hundreds of feet sometimes and you can't get out. And people, you die there wedged because you can't breathe. But once they go out over the ocean, you're no longer going over uneven surfaces, and they stabilize and become much more easy to be able to access. This white ridge here is a cliff face about 25 feet high, and then there's several hundred feet of glacier underneath this, floating. This is an entrance into one of those crevasses, one of those cracks, into the side of this ice tongue. And we go walking through these, and it's the most astounding type of cave that you'll ever see. You're walking on solid ice, the walls are ice, the roof of ice. The sunlight coming through the ice is all these different shades of blue. I mean, it's a magical thing. It's like something out of a Harry Potter film. Multiple levels. You can see people both under and over here, stalactites. The ceilings are covered with ice crystals that have grown. That ice crystal is a little bit thicker than maybe a thin piece of cardboard and as big as a large dinner plate. And when you touch it, it gives off a tone, a sound, like when you hit a crystal glass. And the whole ceiling is covered with those. You know, and then there's a lot of history in where we go down there. This is Ernest Shackleton. You guys may have heard of him. He tried to be the first person to get to the South Pole. He failed. His ship got frozen in the ice. He was going to start an expedition starting here at South Georgia Island, land on Antarctica. His plan was to walk to the South Pole, become the first person to walk across the continent, and then he had people waiting to pick him up here at Ross Island, where I was before. His ship got caught in the ice. They never made it to the continent. He drifted with the ice for a year, and then his ship was crushed by the ice and eventually sank. They just recently found the wreckage. They took the rowboats out. They managed to float in the rowboats for a while, and then they rowed the rowboats to Elephant Island. And then he left all of his men there, took 4 of them, and sailed 700 miles across open ocean in a 24-foot boat to South Georgia Island. This is at his station where his other men were on the Ross Island side. So they used dogs to be able to move around the island there. The dogs are still there. This is his hut where his men lived. They actually used Robert Falcon Scott's supplies because Scott, of course, died trying to get back from the South Pole when he failed to be the first person, but became the second person to get there. And all of that food was left there because they starved to death before they got to the food. So his men, his other men, got stranded there as well, and they used his food to survive. And these are all the supplies that are in his hut. This is like walking into a time capsule. The slowest catch up in the South. When they got rescued, Shackleton, after he got his men back from Elephant Island, sailed when he found out nobody had heard from his other group and rescued his other men going south from New Zealand. And they've got lab notebooks there. They've got scientific specimens there. They've got clothing there. They've got sleeping bags there. They've got magazines and books they were reading there. It's just like stepping back in time. We're going to be going back there again. So if any of you are interested, these next slides are where we're going in 2026. We're going to be going on the Plancius, which runs ecotourism tours. And I've chartered the boat because I wanted to go to a place where people had never been before. We're going to leave from Ushuaia. We're going to go to the Falkland Islands, and we're going to dive the Falkland Islands. We're then going to go to a place called Shag Rocks. Shag Rocks, I'm going to show you a slide in a minute, have never been scuba dove before. Completely new terrain. Nobody's ever sampled there. Nobody's ever seen. From there, we're going to go to South Georgia Island, which is where Shackleton left from. We'll go to the South Orkney Islands, then to Antarctica, and then back to Ushuaia. And we're going to scuba dive in all of those places. This is Shag Rocks. There's only been one person that's ever landed on those rocks in 1956. He did it by helicopter. Nobody has been scuba diving there before. I'm working there with the National Science Foundation, with the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles, and we are going to be collecting everything we can from underwater. And I've done this before. I've spent many trips aboard the Plancius on these ecotourism tours, collecting animals. We do this under permit. We then label everything, take pictures of everything. Anybody who wants to can help me with the work on the surface. I often take younger people. Last time I took 20 Boy Scouts with me that learned to do field research. And we sample scientifically what we're finding. This trip has already been approved as an Explorers Club flag expedition. And anybody who goes on this and helps me meet the scientific objectives, either by sampling underwater or by helping preserve the animals on the surface, will be eligible to be joining the Explorers Club as a member, which is a really prestigious, probably the most prestigious club in the world for scientific exploration. Margaret Mead was a member, Neil Armstrong was a member, Theodore Roosevelt was a member, Edmund Hillary was a member. And so we're going to be going, and some of us will be diving, but most of the people on the trip won't be scuba diving this trip. You don't have to scuba dive to go. And so I've been talking about diving, and we'll wreck dive there on some of the old whaling vessels. We'll dive by icebergs, we'll collect. But most of the people will be doing land activities. So other than seeing stuff underwater, they'll see a lot of these same animals on the surface. And so there's lots of surface activities you can do while we're down there as well. This is actually part of the walk that Shackleton did, coming across South Georgia Island from the side he landed on to get to Grivetkin, where the whaling station was that he started from. And everybody that wants to do this and is physically fit enough will have the opportunity to do that same kind of a walk. Not the entire walk, but maybe the last 5 or 6 kilometers, the last 3 or 4 miles. Shackleton is buried there. We'll all get to see Shackleton's grave. We'll get to see the inland side of some of these islands. They've got penguins there. This is probably the best place I've ever seen for penguins of all of the places I've visited around Antarctica, either Antarctica itself or the subantarctic islands. So I've been working there since 1989. What is that? 35 years now. And this is the most fabulous place I've ever seen. When I say you'll see penguins, let me show you a picture of what penguins look like. There are so many penguins here that you can't possibly get through them all. On one beach alone, it was estimated that there are 250,000 pairs of penguins. They've got elephant seals, they've got southern fur seals, they've got leopard seals, they've got cormorants, they've got albatrosses, all kinds of bird and mammal species to be able to see. And the penguins will come right up to you. One of these penguins came up and was pecking at my son's shoelaces. When all of a sudden all the other penguins ran away, the one penguin stayed by his shoelace, and a leopard seal came up and grabbed the penguin that was sitting 3 inches from his foot, and then swam back off in the ocean again. So there's really cool stuff to see. Active whaling stations there until the 60s. The wreckage of the whaling stations is still there. Animals wandering through them. It's an elephant seal. Remains of the whaling that went on down there. And there are places where we'll be diving where we'll see skulls of whales stacked atop each other underwater. It's sad, but it's also, from a historical perspective, really interesting to see what went on. We'll possibly have the opportunity to visit some of the current research stations. My last 2 trips there, they were closed because of COVID. But the trip before that in 2019, and all of my trips prior to that, we got to stop at stations. This is Vernansky Station, which used to be the British Faraday Station. We stopped there, and this is where they discovered the ozone hole using this machine up here. And this is my son learning how to take readings with the Ukrainian research scientist. And that was, there's a lot of chance to be able to interact with the scientists and see what's actually there. And Barb's from, back to the adult theme here. Let me go back. Whoops. If we go to this research station, which is Ukrainian, you can get a free drink while you're there. They will serve you a free shot of vodka.
Is the vodka any good though?
Well, they make it on station. Not many places have home brewed vodka in Antarctica. Nice. The only thing you've got to do is take off your bra and hang it on the wall. And there is a whole collection of bras hanging on the wall there. From the surface, you'll get to see fantastic stuff. You get a chance to see the ice forming on the sea ice, pancake ice, icebergs that look like things out of fantasy movies. You'll get a chance to go swimming for everybody that wants to do a polar bear plunge. This is my daughter in 2021 going for a swim. Have the opportunity to go kayak and kayaking between the icebergs and the ice. It's really pretty to go see. We have the opportunity to go camping while we're down there. And this is camping. It doesn't get dark, so you've got to sleep in the light. But you get a chance to say that you actually camped on Antarctica if you're interested in doing something like that. These are my scout group that did their camping. And one of my girls, I love the fact that she finished her camping merit badge. Her final night of camping for her merit badge was done here in Antarctica. I think that's just the coolest story ever. So
what's the temperature, Jeff, on that camping?
You got to remember the Antarctic Peninsula is warm. You saw the picture of me earlier in shorts.
Mm-hmm.
In 2019, when I was there, the daytime temperature on one of the days we were there was 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That's anomalous. It shouldn't have been warmer than about 40 or 45. Going out on the peninsula where this trip is going is kind of like getting ready to go skiing if you're going skiing up at Mammoth or, Snow Mountain or something for the day. It's typically in the 15 to 35 degree range during the day, and nighttime it dropped to between 10 and about 20 degrees. So not very cold, relatively speaking. When I was camping on the down in Ross Island, one of the nights I was camping was 45 degrees below zero. So this is a ton warmer. It's not warm by any means, but it's not absurd. And so if you have clothing that you can spend a day out skiing with, you've got adequate clothing to be able to go down to where this trip is going. And they provide the camping gear so that you don't have to worry about that if you go camping. Not everybody can go. They only have space for 40 people. So it's limited. If you're interested in the trip, Barbara has details. So contact her and she'll provide you information and, costing and all that kind of stuff to be able to get in. I will say that the diving and camping are both very limited with terms of numbers. We're only accepting 24 divers and we only have space for about 4 more left right now. And camping site, I think we have space for about 6. So if you're interested, you should sign up sooner rather than later. So talk to Barbara. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. And I notice that apart from Barb, nobody has asked me a question. Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to ask?
Come on off mute, and the floor is open.
I have a question. What are the minimum requirements for the scuba diving?
So Don, if you want to dive down there, first of all, you have to be certified as a scuba diver. You have to be certified or be trained as a dry suit diver. Certification is not required, but training is. And you have to have done at least 30 dry suit dives with at least 2 of those in water temperatures below 40 degrees. So you can actually get the water temperature requirements in Argentina before we leave. Ushuaia Divers runs dive trips out there by reservation. And I've had many groups where we make reservations for 6 or 8 or 10 people the day or 2 or 3 before we board the vessel to go to Antarctica. So you can get the cold water requirements done there before we go down, before we board the boat. But you'd have to get your dry suit dives in here in California before we actually, before you leave the United States. Okay. And then the dive masters on the boat will assess your diving capability in the Falklands, which is warmer. Diving in the Falklands is about 50 degrees. It's pretty toasty, 52. So about California in the wintertime. Yeah. Shag Rocks, I can't promise anything. Shag Rocks, looking at it, the diving conditions are not dissimilar from diving. I dove a group of rocks called Alijos Rocks in Mexico, which are about 200 miles offshore and not protected at all. And we had 12 to 14 foot swells hitting the side of the rocks. It was hard diving. It's not diving for everybody. So we may get to Shag Rocks and say, these conditions are not appropriate for part of the dive group and are appropriate for only some of the people. So I can't promise anything on this. Everything we're talking about is weather, ice, and wind conditions permitting.
Absolutely.
So this is a true expedition. We can't promise anything. But that said, what I can promise is adventure, things that you haven't seen, and an opportunity to maybe do something or find something or discover something literally brand new that's never been seen before.
This trip is absolutely a once in a lifetime. Well, not for you, but a once in a lifetime thing. It's a remarkable. It'd be a remarkable experience.
You know, I've been working as a diving scientist now since 1980. So that's 45 years almost. I've collected about 200 new species of animals with my partners. But I talk to biologists that have been working in the field for 50 years. They have never collected a new animal ever. And the way I get to do that is by going to places that people have never seen before. And this is your opportunity to do the same thing. You could collect a new animal that nobody's ever seen before. And if you do that, you'll be noticed as the collector. And a lot of those animals were named after me by the people that did the taxonomy because they have to name it something.
That's cool. How many dives have you done there, or how many expeditions?
I've done roughly 200 dives in Antarctica over my career, which is nothing compared to one of my friends who's done about 10,000. But 200 is a lot. I've done a little over 100 in the U.S. Antarctic program. And over the course of maybe 8 or 9 ecotourism expeditions, I've done probably another 100 or 120, give or take. I'd have to go and look at my logbook to give you a real number. I know that before I left the ice and during the last National Science one, they said that I exceeded the 100 dive mark within the Antarctic program's dives, which is pretty notable. Most scientists never get to that point.
And is global, I mean, it's kind of a silly question, but is global warming having as much threat in Antarctica as it is in the Arctic? All I ever
In
hear about is
2021, I spent the money to bring all 3 of my children to Antarctica with me because I'm afraid by the time they're adults and have the disposable income to go see it themselves, it's not going to be there. What we call Antarctica will not be there. Things are changing that rapidly. You know, I mentioned it was 70 degrees in 2019. That number was astounding and completely depressing at the same time. That set a new temperature record for the entire continent of Antarctica. And like I said, it should have been 30, 35, 40 degrees, 42 degrees. In the middle of summer, that's a high temperature. And for it to have been 70, think about that, 70 degrees. You walk around here in a t-shirt and shorts. Now, mind you, the temperature down there, you know, conditions can change in the space of an hour, and you could find yourself in, 10 degrees within an hour from 70. But the fact that it even reached that is depressing. So is climate change real? Is that climate or is that weather? People are going to argue that. But in 100 years of recording temperatures down there, that's never been seen before. So yeah, I think that things are changing.
And what would be your response to someone who says, well, what about the impact the boats and taking people down there have on?
There is an impact for boats. There's no doubt about that. There's multiple impacts. One is we are adding to the carbon loading on the planet by driving the boats down there. We've got the impact of people going on shore. It's one of the reasons why the Antarctic Tourism Association limits 100 people from the boat being ashore at any given point in time. And it's also one of the reasons I selected the Plancius. It only holds 108 passengers. Everybody goes ashore twice a day. None of the other boats can say that because all the other boats hold 500 or 600 or 1,000 people, and they go ashore maybe every 4 or 5 days.
I see.
If you're going to go down there, I want people to see it. What's the impact? You have to weigh off 2 different things. Yes, we have an impact going down there. we do our best to mitigate impacts. I didn't show pictures, but before we go ashore, we scrub all of our clothing. We vacuum off any spores. We vacuum out seeds from the pockets. We take everything we own that we're going to take ashore and clean it before we go ashore. We clean our boots every time we come back from a landing, disinfectant, so that we don't transmit or carry things from one place to another. Even with that, because of the global warming primarily, but possibly, and this isn't proven yet because of tourism, avian flu is now being seen in penguins for the first time. And they've been seen in South Georgia where it's warmer. It hasn't been seen further south yet, but the possibility exists for that. We wouldn't know what's going on if it weren't for people going down there, and people would have no awareness or no concern if they don't have a personal, visceral feel for what it's like. So I look at the fact that we will be creating 100 ambassadors to help preserve Antarctica by going down there and seeing it firsthand. We'll be creating 100 lay preachers to say, global warming is real. We need to change what we're doing here every day. Because they'll see it. We don't see it living in Los Angeles. We hear about it and we say, well, you know, maybe, not really. But you'll see it down there. And so you have to balance off the damage that we have versus what benefit we have by being ambassadors, or I don't know what the word is, what's the missionaries to help prevent and change everybody's minds up here. And I, a long time ago, decided that the benefits of bringing people down there, if we're careful, which we are, exceed the minimal amount of damage that we do by seeing it. But it's a really good question. It's a fair question. And we can't go there without some impact.
Are you going to use your rebreather while you're down there?
Not on this trip.
Okay.
It's really too much effort for the benefit. Like I said, the benefits for what we were looking at was to study an environment where we damage the environment using open circuit. I don't have to worry about that here. So it's not worth the infrastructure and the logistical support that would be required.
Jeff, how often did you freeze your gear?
Not very often. You know, I've used one of my early research studies down there was looking at regulator failures when I was in the Antarctic program. And there we were working in 28-degree water and up to minus 40 degrees surface temperatures. And we found that it was the surface temperatures more so than the water temperatures that were causing problems. Almost any of the high-end environmentally sealed regulators down there that I've used in the last 20 years work fine. And when one happens to fail, you turn it off, you breathe off your other one, and while you're breathing off the other one, the first one melts again and goes back to work. It's really not been an issue.
So the valve that you use that comes out of the tank is a double-headed valve.
Correct. Those are provided on the boat.
Okay.
Well, as dive gear goes, they provide the cylinders, the special valve, weight belts, and weights. You bring everything else.
Okay, so you have to bring a reg that is cold certified.
You have to bring 2 regulators that are sealed. And
Okay.
you know, again, Barbara can help you find those and source them through the shop.
All right, and you never froze your rebreather?
We had some interesting failures with the rebreathers. I evaluated 7 different models down there, and some of the models worked really well. Some of the models didn't work at all, and some of them had some failures that I completely did not expect. For example, I couldn't open and close the mouthpieces at all if I breathed on it in advance before I went in the water, because I couldn't turn them to open them because the moisture, the humidity from my exhaled breath froze between the barrel and the housing and essentially welded the 2 together.
Yikes.
Yikes is right. Completely unanticipated. And there were a couple of other things like that, but we wrote a paper for that. I think it's in, it's either Marine Technology Society's journal or it's in the American Academy of Underwater Sciences proceedings. I don't remember where, but John Heine and I wrote a paper on that with how well they lasted in failure modes and things like that, if you're interested.
This John Heine from San Clemente?
John Heine, no, used to be at UC Santa, no, it was up north at Hopkins, not at Hopkins. UC Santa Cruz, one of the Monterey areas. And then he left there and is now in Jacksonville, working with one of the universities out in Florida.
Okay, my last pestiferous question. Tell me about the currents and the surge down below.
Down below where?
The hole.
The hole. If we're diving in the holes, typically we had no current, no surge.
Wow.
Right? Later in the season, when the holes disappeared, we would occasionally when the sea ice edge, sea ice broke out, then we would get currents. And one day I dropped in the current through a hole when the sea ice was close, but it hadn't actually broken out the ice where the hole was yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I dripped 5 feet below the hole opening. The current was so strong I was barely able to get back to the hole to get out, and I aborted the dive.
Oh,
that's not common. Like I said, it's the only dive I've seen like that. Around Falkland Islands, sometimes there was light current, nothing more than we'd see like off Catalina. South Georgia Island, pretty much the same. We would avoid areas that were current scoured, so we'd avoid areas that were more prone to current. Swells, if you're diving near icebergs, are dangerous, so we only dive icebergs where there is very little or no swell, so we don't have to worry about getting stuck underneath one as it's bobbing up and down. Something about Jose jelly is not what we're looking for at the end of a dive.
What does that taste like? Wait a second.
I was a little curious when you said that you were comfortable around the edges of icebergs, because Instagram sends me calving episodes.
Well, it depends on where you're at, and it depends on the size of the icebergs you're at. There's lots of places where it's inappropriate.
Okay.
That's like me saying, it's safe to go diving everywhere. And then I show you the picture of the current coming out of Bay of Fundy with a 60-foot tidal change, or I show you 60-foot seas hitting the north slopes of Hawaii and saying, that's a safe time to go diving. That's stupid.
Okay.
We can dive the north shore of Hawaii in the summertime when you don't have the winter swells coming in, and it's perfectly fine.
Right.
We dive Shark Hole or we dive any of those beaches and we don't have an issue. We just don't dive them in the wintertime.
Right.
And one of the reasons I selected the timing for the 2026 trip is that is the calmest period of time for the areas that we're going to be diving, including Shad Rocks. It's where I figured we had the highest chance of success for being able to dive every place we want to go, and also for having a calm crossing on the Drake Passage.
So how do you coax a sea lion out of the way? What was your...
Well, typically the people on the surface did it. We would have the nets that we would have with, for pulling ice out, and they would gently try to kind of push them a little bit to encourage them to go back down.
I see. Have you ever had an encounter where they got a little nasty with you?
No, not there. I was diving off of Alaska one time in Whittier, I think, and I had an adult elephant seal come in, no, not elephant, stellar sea lion, and take its jaws and stick them on my mouth like this, and its mouth on my arm like this. And then at that point in time, it just sat there looking at me, waiting to see what I was going to do.
Yikes.
Yikes.
Yeah. What about a full face mask? Have you tried those down there?
I have. And they definitely help protect your face temperature-wise, but I find that the problems with full face masks that I personally have exceed the benefits from a temperature perspective, and I don't use them. I have trouble equalizing. I always have. I have to be able to pinch my nose. A lot of masks, that's not easy to do. You're using a mask block in the inner spiro, or you're using a block in the Ocean Reef Neptune. You know, the Mark 48 by Kirby Morgan, you can actually get to a nose pocket to pinch. But for the most part, I'd rather just use a regular old scuba face mask, and it's been fine down there.
Okay. Well, I find that like I've been in 40-degree water and a full face mask. What a huge difference.
It
And
does make a big difference temperature-wise, but it's not necessary in my opinion. You know, for what I do.
Well, I would think unless there's any last minute questions, I want to be courteous to our crowd here. And going once, going twice. Thank you so much, Jeff. I am going on this trip, you guys, and I would love to have you the last 4 spots or whatever it is, or the non-diver spots too. Come join us.
I would say, even if you don't want to dive and you're a diver, come on the trip because it's fabulous. And don't be afraid to bring friends and family and children because it's a great experience for everybody.
How rough are the seas, I guess? What's a
Varies. I've gone across on the Drake some trips where it never got to be more than 2 or 3 feet. And there have been other trips where I've come back where it's 20 or 30. So, but the boat actually handles it really well, quite frankly.
Hey, Jeff, how big is that boat again?
Just under 300 feet.
Okay.
So, and it, like I said, it handles really well.
And what's the name of the boat again?
The Plancius.
I'll put it in the chat.
I'm actually looking at some of the comments here. I noticed that one of the comments here was from Tim Morin, who went with me on one of my trips, I think in 2021. And Tim, if you're still there, you want to unmute and talk a little bit about it from your perspective? No, I guess he's gone.
There he goes. There he goes.
I'm trying, Jeff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, you guys, this is a trip of a lifetime, and I would encourage everybody, diver or not, to go on this. My wife has been begging me to take her back with us on one of these trips, and we're going to do it one of these days. But you guys, yeah, this is something that you will never stop talking about. You show a picture of the penguins or any of the sea lions or the underwater environment, and instantly you have a conversation, and people are absolutely loving every slide, every photograph that you can take. And it is well worth it. I'm going back someday without a doubt. It was that good. And they take such great care of you on the Plancius that it's I mean, it really is one of the nicer cruise ships I've been on as far as it goes for what we were doing down there. So absolutely encourage everybody to take a hard look at this and, you know, get it done because you will never, ever regret it.
I will say that Tim has talked to me about coming on this trip, but his wife has some health issues right now. So depending on how she feels when we get closer to the trip, Tim and his wife, Debbie, may well be with us. And I'm hoping that happens.
Right.
I hope she's doing better.
Yeah, me too. She is, Jeff, and I'm the one laid up now. I just had a total knee replacement 3 days ago.
Okay, bionic man, let's kind of get you back into shape again so you're ready.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again so much, Jeff. Thank you everyone for showing up tonight. Like I said, I will be getting back to you. And if you have any further questions, just shoot me an email at barbara@malibudivers.com. Big round of applause. Yay,
Yeah.
Jeff.
Thank you all.
And
Share the recording of it with all of us. That would be fantastic.
sure,
Thank
it'll
you.
be up on our YouTube channel, and I'm going to turn it off for a sec.